Hello! In this chapter, we'll be discussing stress, coping, and anxiety disorders. So let's begin with understanding what stress actually is. Stress is our response to a situation that disrupts our physical or mental equilibrium. So if you imagine a teeter-totter that you would see on a playground, and in a perfect state, it is exactly even on both sides. When we are dealing with stress, one side goes down, the other side goes up. And as such, we start to feel out of our homeostasis or our middle of feeling of just well-being. A stressful event can trigger the fight or flight response, causing hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol to surge through the body, as well as norepinephrine, which is a transmitter that is basically in charge of the whole fight or flight response, to course through our neural system. On the right-hand side, what you'll see is scans from the Mayo Foundation. You'll see on the all the way to the right, optimal functioning. The brain has many areas lit up. Neural activity is rocking. The picture on the left, you see the neural activity is very subdued. And again, when we see stressed and depressed people, we oftentimes see people who have a hard time accomplishing anything. And part of it is because their brain has given itself over to all of these hormones and norepinephrine to manage the stress. Now, some stress can be very beneficial. It produces a boost that drives us and gives us the energy to help us get through situations such as an exam or a deadline. I'm sure all of us have at one point or another had a deadline, i.e., your paper's due tomorrow and you haven't started it yet, and you have that overwhelming sensation inside of you that, oh my God, I got to get this done, and you have to buckle down. This is actually very helpful. A little bit of stress releases not just our, adrenaline and cortisol, but it also gives us sometimes the opportunity to get, on top of something like an exam or a quiz or a paper that otherwise we would just keep procrastinating. Some people live in traumatic situations. These kinds of traumatic situations include domestic violence, living through a war, living through a natural disaster. And this causes the body to be in a chronic state of stress, which is very bad. Can stress make you sick? Absolutely. Research shows that stress can contribute to the development of major illnesses, such as heart disease, depression, obesity. It can also lead people to self-medicate using alcohol and drugs. An extreme amount of stress can have health consequences and adversely affect the immune system, the cardiovascular system, the neuroendocrine system, and the central nervous systems. So, in terms of what can stress do, it affects every aspect of your body. If you look over on the right with that chart I have up there, these are not life-threatening necessarily illnesses, although, obviously asthma has been known to result in people's deaths. But if you just look at the common ailments people suffer from, in red you have people who say they're highly stressed. Yellow are people who, just general population. And what you'll see is we're talking sometimes triple the feeling, and if at least double the feeling of problems when going through high levels of stress. Stress also impacts our sleep patterns, often causing insomnia when our brains won't shut off. And again, what we have to remember is that if we don't get 7 or 8 hours of quality sleep, our bodies are not regenerating and refreshing for the next day. And as a consequence, we are not getting the hormones that we need in our body to repair any of the damage. More importantly, if we're not getting the sleep we need, our brain's not being refreshed either. We sometimes focus on unhappy thoughts, problems, and other negative stressors until they become the dominant focus in our mind. How do we manage stress successfully? Well, it's pretty straightforward. You have to engage in some physical activity. Why? Because when you are engaging in physical activity, your body releases a chemical called an endorphin. And this is a type of transmitter in the brain, and it makes us feel good. So endorphins are something that you will see not just when you're running a marathon, but also when people are engaged in sex and at the end they feel fabulous, they want to cuddle, they want to hang out. That again, they're releasing their endorphins. Eating a healthy diet, if you are being good to your body will be good to you. Getting at least 7 hours of sleep, again, it is vital. That might be the most important aspect of managing your stress. Finding an outlet that takes your mind off of your problems, such as a hobby like playing games, spending time with your kids, socializing. And then there's always meditation and yoga. And although we might think of meditation and yoga as something that, people do when they have tons of money and they don't need to work and they can just do yoga all day in their Lululemon outfits, it's actually something that can be done at home. Your cat can help, your dog can help. There's a million videos showing you this, but it makes you feel better. Positive affirmations in which you remind yourself that you can handle the day-to-day bumps in the road. The reality is we sometimes allow problems to become much bigger than they actually are because we've created this monster. Whereas if we say, you know what, I've been through worse, I can make it through this too, and I'm going to move on with my day and be successful in achieving this goal or overcoming this issue. Positive attitude, positive affirmations, very, very helpful. Here is our stress curve. Everyone experiences stress and anxiety at one time or another. The difference between them is that stress is a response to a threat in a situation. Anxiety is the reaction to the stress. When faced with chronic or trauma-based stress, a person may develop an anxiety disorder. So a little bit of stress that is situationally appropriate is going to be a good thing. So if you look at the stress curve, that yellow is our optimal amount of stress. We know we have to get something done. We have a deadline. We have a paper to write. We have a project to submit at work. And it gives us a little bit of a push emotionally and mentally to get it done. Now, if you're in a constant state of stress, overload, you're going to see the stress curve beginning to go down into the orange and the red. This is bad. When we get too stressed out, we burn out. And we sometimes have what's called a breakdown, an emotional breakdown. So the next section that we're going to talk about are those anxiety disorders that oftentimes will develop when people can't manage their stress or have so much stress in their life they don't know how to manage it. So let's start off by defining what an anxiety disorder is. These are disorders that share features of excessive fear and anxiety and related to behavioral disturbances. Fear is the emotional response to real or perceived imminent threat. And anxiety is anticipation of future threat. So fear is there's a giant wasp flying around and you're afraid, that's real. Or, the wasp may not be the kind that is going to just randomly sting you, but it is actually a harmless bumblebee or something. And, it could be perceived threat, but the fear is the same. Anxiety is about worrying what's going to happen down the road. So you sit in your house and you think, oh my God, what happens if a wasp gets in my house? What happens if someone comes to my door and tries to kill me? So anxiety is really focusing on the potential of future threats. These two states overlap, but they also differ. Fear is more often associated with surges of autonomic arousal necessary for fight or flight, thoughts of immediate danger, and escape behaviors. So again, if you think of that wasp flying around, you're thinking, how do I get away? How do I get the wasp out of here? How do I kill the wasp? How do I kill the wasp's family? All of those things. Anxiety, on the other hand, is more often associated with muscle tension and vigilance in preparation for future danger and cautious or avoidant behaviors. So anxiety is after we got rid of the wasp and now we're looking around for whatever wasps are hiding, waiting to kill us because we have eliminated their brother or dad, if you think of wasps having families. The point being is anxiety is all about that muscle tension and vigilance, that anticipation of what's going to happen next. Sometimes the level of fear or anxiety is reduced by pervasive avoidance behaviors. We just avoid anything that could potentially give us stress. Panic attacks feature prominently within the anxiety disorder as a particular type of fear response. And we're going to talk in much more detail about panic attacks in a few minutes, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail just yet. Panic attacks are not limited to anxiety disorders, but rather can be seen in other mental disorders as well. So these are the anxiety disorders that we're going to discuss in this PowerPoint. Separation anxiety. This is something that anyone with children has experienced, and you see this on the first day of school, when the child has to go to daycare for the first time. It can be very traumatizing. An individual with separation anxiety disorder displays anxiety and fear atypical, and that's the important word there, atypical, for his or her age and development level over separation from people and places to which he or she has a strong attachment. There is no specific age when this begins. We see it on a regular basis in children, but that's because mom and dad are their entire world, and when they get pushed out of the nest to attend school or go to childcare, that is a fairly normal response to my whole world is falling apart. Separation anxiety can develop into other disorders, including a panic disorder, major depressive disorder, and agoraphobia. It generally persists in individuals under the age of 18 for at least 4 weeks. So, that first week of school when the kid seems reluctant to go, he doesn't want to leave mom, that's going to eventually dissipate over the next week or so. However, if it goes on for 4 weeks, then there's a bigger issue. For adults, separation anxiety can go on for 6 months or more before it's really diagnosed. Then we have selective mutism. It is a childhood disorder typified by the inability to speak in certain circumstances. Specifically, it is a consistent failure to speak in certain social situations where there is a natural expectation of speaking, such as school. And it is often identified when this child starts school. Selective mutism must be in evidence for more than the time span of 1 month. and it must be determined to have a detrimental impact on school or work. So, your precious 5-year-old who never shuts up at home goes to school and won't even say their own name. Now, the first week of school, this is fairly normal. Little kids are very shy, and oftentimes, if they're not feeling an overwhelming sense of comfort, they're going to resort to this selective mutism. However, after a week or two, usually kids warm up to their environment and they become integrated into the social activities of school. When it doesn't end and the student or the child does not become integrated into the social fabric of the school, then it becomes an issue and needs to be addressed. Then we have phobias. We all have phobias, but there's a difference between a phobia where we just don't like something and a phobia that is often going to interfere with our life or our social life. Phobias involve having a persistent fear of an object, place, or situation that is disproportional to the threat or danger posed by the object of the fear. So, for example, a lot of people are afraid of spiders. Well, you look at a spider who probably weighs less than an ounce, and then there's you who probably weighs a heck of a lot more than an ounce, and you think, well, I could totally jump on that spider and kill it. But then in your mind, you go to that length of, oh my God, the spider's going to escape, and it's going to find me, and it's going to crawl into my ear, and I'm going to end up dying from some terrible dread disease. The point being is, the person who has the phobia will go to great lengths to avoid the object of the fear and experience great distress if it is encountered. And these are irrational fears and reactions that interfere with social and work life. So again, we can have phobias, but they're not an anxiety disorder unless they interfere with our social or work life. There are 5 subtypes of specific phobias: animal, natural environment, blood injection or injury. People freak out with needles. We've seen it all the time. Situational, some people have a hard time when they are in an elevator. Some people have a hard time in a tunnel or on a bridge. And then there are other phobias of which people can be afraid of everything. So again, what we're seeing here is an irrational fear that occurs over the long term and interferes with someone's social or work life. Social phobia, which involves fear of social situations, is a separate disorder. It is an anxiety disorder involving discomfort around social interaction and concern about being embarrassed and judged by others. Now, we all have that moment where, we don't want our pants to split and everyone to see our butt because it's embarrassing. But this is taken to a higher degree. This discomfort will be experienced as fear and anxiety and will be accompanied by an autonomic arousal, including diaphoresis, which is sweating to an unusual degree, apnea, which is suspension of external breathing. It's literally we stop breathing because we're so frightened that we just forget to breathe, which is, again, in a situation where people have an extreme phobia, their bodies just seize up. Then there's tremors, tachycardia, which means an abnormally fast heart rate, and everyone's favorite, nausea. It can range in severity to a discomfort which can be circumvented and adapted to a virtually disabling fear with an infiltration into multiple areas of life. And they believe the prevalence of social anxiety disorder is about 7% of the general population. The onset usually begins in the early teens, and a major risk factor is obesity in teenagers, because teenagers are mean to each other and they will call each other on the most absurd things, and being obese as a teenager might be one of the saddest ways of being mocked, because they feel out of control, which causes their anxiety, which usually results in them wanting to eat to bury their feelings. Keeping in mind that social anxiety disorder is not the same thing as someone who's nervous about getting up in front of a group of people to give a presentation. That is extremely normal. Something like 90% of people fear having to give presentations. That is not social anxiety disorder. That is just normal, stressful experience about having to perform in front of others. Then we move into panic disorders and panic attacks. According to the DSM-5, the most prominent diagnostic criteria for panic disorder is reoccurring unexpected panic attacks. So if you're not having panic attacks, you're not going to have a diagnosis of panic disorder. Panic attacks are unexpected. They're impossible to predict, and the patient usually says they're coming out of the blue. And basically what's happening is you get a surge of complete and total fear that usually and sometimes often occurs during a time of calm, such as while you're relaxing, sleeping, or engaging in an otherwise enjoyable activity. And the DSM-5 describes a panic attack as an abrupt surge of intense fear or intense discomfort that reaches a peak within minutes. So you're sitting there watching TV, and all of a sudden in your mind something flits in. Oh, I haven't talked to my mom. She's probably dead on the side of the road. And although that seems comical to a certain degree, it induces this unbelievable state of panic where you can't breathe, you can't think, everything seems to overwhelm your sense of reason. Panic disorder, the prevalence is about 2 to 3% for adults and adolescents. And one of the bigger issues is not just having a panic attack, but when is the next one going to come? So, in addition to having these panic attacks, the patient experiences worry or fear about having a panic attack and change their behaviors and routines to avoid these panic attacks. So it's this constant cycle of, I have a panic attack, so now I'm going to do everything I can to avoid having another one. And of course, this is not something that you can always physically manage on your own or emotionally manage on your own, because it likes to creep up on you when you're least expecting it. These symptoms are not related to substance use or other medical or psychiatric conditions. A lot of people, when they are smoking marijuana, will report that they feel paranoid, and that might induce a panic attack. Well, that is not related to what a real panic attack is. That's just being paranoid because you smoke too much pot. Common features of panic attacks include an accelerated heartbeat, pounding heart, chest pain, numbness, a choking sensation, feeling dizzy or lightheaded, feeling detached from oneself, like you're looking at yourself from above or from afar, trembling, sweating, chills or hot flashes, nausea, the fear you're losing control, and more importantly, the fear of dying. A lot of people who have panic attacks end up in the emergency room convinced that they're either having a heart attack or a stroke because their body is so overwhelmed by what it's dealing with. And the reality, of course, is that when the doctor does his diagnostic assessment, it's going to come out that, you're stressed out because your daughter's on drugs, or you're stressed out because you've been cheating on your wife, any number of things, and these panic attacks are a physical representation of the emotional stress you are dealing with. Another anxiety disorder is called agoraphobia. And you might have heard of this in regards to somebody who never leaves their house. Well, that's the most extreme version. Agoraphobics are most commonly known as people who have a fear of public places. It is an anxiety disorder involving a persistent fear of certain environments, often either due to their crowdedness or openness, disproportional to the threat or danger posed by the environment. So a lot of people don't like to be in the middle of crowds. They feel like they can't breathe. This disorder typically develops in late adolescence or early childhood and is more common in women. Risk factors include stressful life events, poor health, lower education, lower income, and biological or genetic factors. Keeping in mind that agoraphobes are not necessarily exclusively stuck in their house, but rather are they take a lot of care to avoid those areas that will give them the most stress. So somebody who really doesn't like being around crowds may avoid areas that tend to be crowded. So if you go to the Italian market in South Philadelphia on the weekends, it can be very crowded. So somebody would probably say, nope, don't want to do it, gonna stay home and watch TV or stop at the Wawa. And for those of you who are not in the Mid-Atlantic, Wawa is our version of a superior convenience food place, which is awesome. And you should come to the Mid-Atlantic states and go to Wawa. And then finally, generalized anxiety disorder, otherwise known as GAD or GAD. People with generalized anxiety disorder find themselves extremely worried about all sorts of things when there is little or no reason to worry. It's almost like it's become a habit. What can I worry about today? People with this disorder may be anxious just trying to get through an average day, always believing that things will go badly. Surveys of the general population suggest that during a person's lifetime, somewhere between 4 to 6% of people will experience generalized anxiety disorder. So if you want to convert that into numbers, maybe 1 in 20. Women seem to be more susceptible to generalized anxiety disorder than men, occurring approximately twice as frequently in females. Now, here's one of the elements you have to keep in mind. In the Western countries, United States, Canada, Northern Europe, a lot of men have been socialized in society that expressing their emotions is a bad thing. So they are less likely to seek out help for anxiety disorders. However, men are much more likely to deal with alcoholism, drug addiction, and the rate of suicide is so much higher in men because, again, the theory is that men have not been given that social permission to cry, to vent, to have long conversations, processing how they feel about their relationships or their problems. So, when we look at these numbers, they are skewed by the socialization factors in our culture. The most common age range for the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder appears to be between the ages of 45 and 59, and the diagnosis begins to decline after the age of 60, mostly because people are like, okay, I've made it to this age, I'm gravy, it's awesome, I'm not going to worry about every little thing anymore. But there are still people who worry about every little thing, even when they're 90. So symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder must occur for the majority of days over a 6-month time span. So having generalized anxiety for a few days because mom's in the hospital or your kid decided to go on a ski vacation and didn't mention it to you till he was halfway there, that's situational. This anxiety disorder has to be over a 6-month time span with the majority of the days. Chronic, constant, and often unsubstantiated worry plus 3 of the following symptoms: muscle tension, gastrointestinal discomfort or diarrhea. We always say our stomachs hurt when we're upset. Well, it's because our body has tightened up. Irritability, fatigue, edginess, restlessness, and sleep difficulties. People who are dealing with these kinds of feelings know exactly how they feel. So how do we manage these anxiety disorders? Well, first we have psychotherapy. And there are 2 kinds of psychotherapy that tend to work very well with anxiety disorders, and they're often done in conjunction with one another. Cognitive therapy, and remember, cognitive means how we think, helps patients to see how automatic thoughts and false beliefs lead to exaggerated emotional responses such as anxiety. Behavioral therapy involves gradual and desensitizing exposure to anxiety-provoking situations and stimuli, and may include relaxation training to moderate the physiological responses to these. So one is about how we think, and the other one is about how we behave. Combine them, and the theory is that the combination will help people move past their anxiety disorder. The reality is that people often need help with pharmaceuticals just to kind of keep things going because, we can control how we act, we can control what we're focusing on, but remember, there's a whole bunch of neurotransmitters and hormones and other chemicals in our bodies that have gotten used to being used on a regular basis. So pharmaceuticals will then help us manage those automatic issues. So medication can be a short-term or a long-term treatment depending on the severity of the symptoms and other medical conditions and the individual's circumstances. So oftentimes you'll see somebody who is being treated intensively for 6 months and then they're better. They've managed. They've learned how to figure it out. Other people, 6 months is just not enough. Their problems are so deep that they need to be on these medications long term. Other people, they may be fine after 6 months. They spend the next 5 years happy as a clam. There's a triggering event, and then they need to go back into therapy with pharmaceutical assistance. So again, every patient and client is going to be different, but there are options for these patients. The most popular antidepressant out there are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, otherwise known as SSRIs. So something like Wellbutrin or Paxil, these are the kinds of meds that relieve the symptoms by blocking the reabsorption of serotonin, which leaves more serotonin available, which improves our mood. So in a sense, it's almost like happy juice. So if you imagine your brain as a sponge, and you squeeze the sponge, and all the serotonin comes out, and it bathes the surface of the sponge or the brain with serotonin, and it makes us feel good. Well, what this medication does is it prevents that sponge from reabsorbing it. Instead, it stays nice and filled on the surface with serotonin, which makes us happier, less stressed out, less anxious people. Another option is serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, or SNRIs. This is also an antidepressant which increases the level of the neurotransmitter serotonin and norepinephrine by inhibiting their reabsorption into the brain. So again, it's looking at two different neurotransmitters that we're allowing our brains to be bathed in. Then we have benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are often known by their generic names or their specific names of Xanax, Valium, Ativan. And these are anti-anxiety meds which promote relaxation. They reduce muscular tension and other physical symptoms of anxiety. The biggest issue with benzodiazepines is long-term use may require an increase into the dose to achieve the same effect, which then leads to issues with tolerance and dependence. So you do see people becoming addicted to benzodiazepines, increasing their dosage to a absurd or addictive level, and then they end up having a bigger issue because they're now addicted to these medications, which in this particular situation, if a person goes cold turkey, can have catastrophic consequences. Benzodiazepines are one of those things that when we cut them cold turkey can cause our heart or our lungs to literally stop. So it is one of the addictions that really does need a doctor or nurse managed rehabilitative time period, because there are issues associated with cutting cold turkey. Finally, there are tricyclic antidepressants which block the absorption of the neurotransmitters serotonin or norepinephrine, increasing the levels of the two neurotransmitters in the brain. So they're very much like serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, or number 2. However, these are old school antidepressants and have a variety of side effects. These medications are used if the physician has a concern that the patient may be overly dependent on benzodiazepines. So, the reality is, anxiety disorders can be managed if not cured, and if you believe that you may have an anxiety disorder, you should definitely go see your doctor and discuss your symptoms. So that's it for this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or text me. Otherwise, have a fabulous day.